Thank you. That was a very kind introduction. I'm going to share my PowerPoint. Harry, can I get a confirmation that it is indeed there?
Yes, we can all
Okay.
see
Yes.
it. Yep.
All right. So good afternoon, everyone. I want to begin with a quick note of thanks to Jackie and Marissa and the Africa at Noon organizers for inviting me to speak today, to Harry for coordinating my virtual visit with so much patience and care, and to all of you for joining me. I'm very grateful for your virtual presence. My talk today is titled Love, Money, and Modern Life of Photoromances in 1970s Côte d'Ivoire. It focuses on the genre of the photoromance, or a comic that uses captioned photographs in lieu of illustrations. Photoromances were a common feature in 1970s Ivorian magazines. Essentially, soap operas in magazine format, photoromances staged the dramas of heterosexual intimacy in the capital city of Abidjan. Pictured in bell bottoms, mini dresses, and platform shoes, local models and actors reenacted classic conflicts of conjugal and family life with provocative titles like A Thwarted Love, Blackmail, and He Tricked Her. Photoromances introduced tales of men who cheated, teenagers who dishonored their families, and women who plotted revenge. Now, these photoromances emerged in a very specific historical moment, an era of economic growth known as the Ivoirian miracle. In its first 2 decades of independence, the production of cash crops like cocoa and coffee fueled Ivorian prosperity. The city of Abidjan became legendary in the wider West African region for its towering skyscrapers, sweeping boulevards, and animated nightlife. As locals commonly joked, you go to Paris and it reminds you of Abidjan. Now, the Ivoirian miracle has inspired a great deal of work in economics and political science with focuses on themes of modernization and development. There's been surprisingly little attention paid to the social and cultural consequences of this transformation. And as a historian of gender and sexuality in Cote d'Ivoire, I've become increasingly interested in cultural production and the ways that Ivorian playwrights, novelists, filmmakers, and others have interpreted gender and conjugal relations and used their art to navigate changing ideas about family and society. As the literary scholar Stephanie Newell has written, West African popular culture and literature really overflow with culturally hybrid, fluid constructions of gender. Media can serve as sites not only for representations of gender power relationships, but also for attempts to symbolically resolve them, often through engagement with topics like marriage, manhood, and money. And so, with that in mind, I'd like to share some preliminary thoughts about gender, power, and social change as depicted in these 1970s photomances. And because I know this is an interdisciplinary space, I really do welcome any feedback on my approach to and framing of these texts. I read these photomances as hybrid texts that mirrored the hopes and frustrations of a changing Cote d'Ivoire. As the state pushed reforms to restructure so called traditional families to match its ambitions for modernization, photoromances captured the tensions between state policies and the lived realities of Ivorian citizens. Centering themes of love, infidelity, money, and ambition, photoromances created discursive environments that allowed readers to make sense of their changing society in these first decades of independence. And so, to give you a sense of where I'm going today, first, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Cote d'Ivoire and its print media in the era of independence. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the 1964 Civil Code and its campaign to reform this very structure of the Ivorian family, as well as the role of state media in pushing these reforms. Then I'll talk about the photoromance itself as a genre, where it comes from. And then I'm going to talk more about the photoromance in Cote d'Ivoire with a focus on the work of the photographer Paul Kodjo and his production of photoromances for Ivoire Dimanche, or Idée, which was a state magazine that was launched in the 1970s. And then finally, I'm going to zoom in on two examples of photoromances. One is Notre enfant a sauvé notre amour, our child has saved our love. The other is Marthe l'Ingrate, or Marthe the Ungrateful. So let's begin. Côte d'Ivoire declared its independence on August 7th, 1960, and this new nation was a one-party state led by the Parti démocratique de Côte d'Ivoire, or PDCI. Now, like many leaders of his generation, the first president, Félix Houphouët-Boigny, frequently presented himself as the father of the nation. Ivoirians commonly referred to him as Papa Houphouët, or Le Vieux, meaning the old man. And as an explicitly patriarchal head of state, he looked to project his vision of an ideal family onto the formal political sphere. And we saw this in the paranoid first years of his presidency, when Houphouët-Boigny, much like an imperious father, demonstrated that he had very little tolerance for the popular dissent of his children. But Houphouët-Boigny's preoccupation with the family went much further and beyond the metaphorical. He also sought to reform the family itself. In October 1964, Côte d'Ivoire introduced a sweeping set of laws to transform Ivoirian households and usher citizens into the so-called modern world. The 1964 Civil Code enacted reforms to virtually every element of conjugal life, addressing everything from civil status registration to naming practices to marriage, divorce, matrimonial property, inheritance, and more. And the most heralded of these reforms were the abolition of what one legislator called the three-headed hydra of so-called backward traditional practices of polygamy, bride wealth, and matrilineal inheritance. And perhaps most importantly, the code also established the father as the official head of household, with near complete legal authority over his wife and children. Now, state print publications were an important medium for the dissemination of this new vision. I'm not sure how well you can see it on the screen, but this is a special issue of the PDCI party newspaper Fraternité that was dedicated to the new civil code. The headline reads, "The universality of the law will assure the unity of the nation." And the photograph that you can see there depicts someone, presumably a man, putting a wedding band on another person's, presumably a woman's, finger. And the caption reads, "Based on the mutual consent of the spouses, monogamous marriage is now the foundation of the Ivoirian family. Bride wealth and matrilineal inheritance, as respectable as they may have been, are now outdated customs." So in this sense, the Civil Code really aimed to bring about a social revolution, the production of the monogamous, patriarchal, heterosexual, nuclear family as the fundamental unit of the new modern Ivoirian nation. This was not simply a legal reform, but an attempt to transform the basic structure of Ivoirian intimate life. Now, there's a lot more I could say about the Civil Code, and I'm happy to talk about it further in the Q&A. But suffice it to say that I think it's quite essential context for understanding the social circumstances in which these photoromances and their conjugal plot lines emerge in 1970s Côte d'Ivoire. Now, I think it's worth noting that in the absence of reliably preserved and accessible state archives, print media like Fraternité can be very valuable sources of historical data. The issue of Fraternité that I just mentioned actually printed the entirety of the Civil Code word for word in print for its national readership. And this was not an uncommon practice in the state-controlled Ivoirian media, which regularly reprinted the text of legislative debates and political speeches. But if for a historian, this is a great convenience, it can also be a liability. Most print publications during this period were state-run, and until 1990, Côte d'Ivoire was a one-party state. And so there is a very reasonable scholarly impulse to dismiss these publications as state or party propaganda that simply uncritically disseminates a nationalist vision of capitalist modernization and development. Now, while I am certainly judicious in how I approach these materials, I do think that framing them exclusively as state propaganda can limit engagement with the actual content of these publications, which could be much more provocative than you'd expect. My thinking here is influenced by the work of historians like Derek Peterson and Emma Hunter, who have argued that much more than sources of historical data, African print publications were also very highly creative, experimental, and interactive endeavors. And I think Ivoire Dimanche, or Idée, as I'll be referring to it, is an example of this. It was launched in February 1971 as a weekly supplement to the state newspaper Fraternité Matin. In addition to the Photoromances, which I promise I will be getting to very shortly, Ide also published reported features on sports, fashion, and popular culture. It featured advice columns, opinion pieces, letters to the editor, and so on. It also had a fairly strong readership. In 1973, it was publishing some 63,000 copies a week, with an average of 5 readers per copy for a total of 315,000 readers. And while urban men, as the most literate of the Ivorian population during this time, constituted the majority of their readership, their audience did include both women and men from both urban and rural parts of the country. I want to very briefly note there was a privately owned monthly women's magazine called Aukwa that launched in 1972 that also published Photoromances that align with some of the themes I'm speaking about today. But for today, I'm going to focus on Idée. Because while it's clear that these state publications certainly were working with the state to promote family reforms of the civil code and promote this modernizing narrative of the Ivoirian miracle, Idée was also deeply invested in following Ivoirian citizens as they navigated the social consequences of these transformations. Recognizing how exciting and destabilizing this proposed transition from traditional to modern family life could be, Ide actively considered what it meant for women and men to live these changes, even at the level of their intimate lives. So to give you a sense of Ide's editorial perspective, this is a quick selection of its early magazine covers from its first year of publication in 1971. Ide was interested in society and culture, consumerism, and comportment. It tried to capture the zeitgeist of the independence era from maxi skirts to marriage policy. On the top left, you can see the first ever issue of Ide, and the cover story was titled Abidjan, la mode longue, which was a surprisingly in-depth reported feature on the popularity of the maxi skirt in Abidjan. Subsequent covers considered the experiences of single mothers, another one about urban nightlife and fears of immoral behavior, another on working women in the professional world, and another on conjugal life. That's the one on the top right, where you can see the words, hope, mariez-vous, or get married, which was a cover story on expectations of the civil code and on local resistance to registering their marriages as civil unions. Although the article ultimately supports the civil code as a sign of social progress, it's also quite clear-eyed about the pains of this transition. Quote, a civil marriage is in some ways a certificate of modernity. But for women, modernity most often translates as emancipation, which is why, instinctively, men are wary of it and very rarely get married at the town hall. And so if the sampling of cover stories is any indication, changing social and gender norms loomed large in the minds of the magazine's editorial staff. And it follows that gender and gender relations were really at the heart of Ide's aesthetics of modernity. And I think the Photoromance is part of that story. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn to talking a little bit about the genre of the Photoromance. So it has its origins in 1940s Italian Photoromances. Fun fact, Sophia Loren began her career in 1950s Photoromances. Elsewhere, you may see them referred to as photo novels, photo comics, photo plays, photoroman, roman photo, or look reads. But again, all of these terms describe the same concept, a comic that uses captioned photographs in lieu of illustrations. And the Photoromance was a globally popular genre that spread from Italy to other parts of Europe, Latin America, and Africa in the mid 20th century. The most notable African example comes from South Africa, From 1968 to 72, African Film, which was an affiliate of Drum Magazine and had a Pan-African circulation, published a popular crime serial about Lance Spearman, the African James Bond. Known as the Spear, Lance was a suave crime buster who had a way with the ladies. Matthias Krings has written about the spear, and elsewhere on the continent, Buki Badigessen has written some really interesting work on Yoruba language photoplays. Lily Saint has written about cowboy westerns in South African photo comics. But I would say that by contrast, Ivorian photoromances, like their Italian counterparts, were very decidedly soapy. And as Paola Bonifacio has written, Italian photoromancy were very commonly critiqued as vehicles of capitalist and patriarchal ideology, or, quote, cheap and trite narratives of love relationships produced for a feminine readership. But I would say that in the case of Côte d'Ivoire, I think I view photoromances a bit differently. And my thinking here is influenced by the literary scholar Tsitsi Ella Jaji's concept of sheen reading. She coined this while writing about Bingo, which was a 1950s Francophone African glossy magazine. And she argues that by presenting examples of modern consumption and comportment, the magazine invited readers to use the shiny, reflective surfaces and shiny, reflective, and sometimes distorting surfaces of its glossy pages to create some generative openings for the improvisation of new modern identities. And while the pages of Idée were not literally glossy, I don't think they had the money for that. Its photoromances, I think, lend themselves to a kind of sheen reading. They offered a template of modernity with all of its possibilities and frustrations for women and men to reflect on, emulate, and debate. Now I'd like to turn to Paul Codjo, who was the architect of Idé's photoromances. Codjo was a multi-talented photojournalist, widely considered the father of Ivorian photography. And he was most active in the 1960s and 1970s when he was a key documentarian of this moment of prosperity that we refer to as the Ivorian miracle. He was also a photojournalist. He documented President Houphouët-Boigny's political activities. That photo in the middle is of Houphouët-Boigny with Georges Pompidou. But Codjo was also very passionate about fashion and nightlife photography, as you can see from those two images on the left and right. He was really interested in capturing the optimism and excitement of the independence era. And if you're interested in knowing more about him, I should note that the 2022 documentary film Je reste photographe narrates some of Codjo's career along with ongoing efforts to preserve his archive. Here is my shameless plug. I am currently working with the documentary's director, Ananias Lekidago, on a project funded by the Modern Endangered Archives program over at UCLA to digitize Codjo's photographic archive. I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A, but I'll very quickly say that you may notice that some of the photos in my slides are nicer in quality than others. Those are the photos that have already been digitized in the Codjo archive. The others are just my own mediocre photography. So now I'm going to turn to the Idée photoromance. Paul Codjo debuted his photoromances in 1971, very soon after the magazine launched. He worked in collaboration with the writer Atta Kofi to stage his dramas against the very modernist landscape and bourgeois interiors of 1970s Abidjan. His actors were locals, often scouted by Codjo himself on the streets of Abidjan. Some also performed in theater with the Institut National des Arts, or INA. Others went on to star in some of the first Ivoirian feature films. And as they dressed in contemporary fashions, these actors portrayed themes of love and deception that would have been familiar to any Abidjan resident during this time. And unlike a formal crime series like South Africa's African Film, the Lance Spearman one, these photoromances told stories over just 4 to 5 installments. The same actors often appeared in multiple photoromances, but their characters and storylines would change. So these were discrete narratives with no explicit character development over time. So now let's turn to our first photoromance. Debuting in April 1971, Idé's first photoromance was titled Notre enfant a sauvé notre amour, or Our Child Saved Our Love. It centers on the beautiful executive secretary Georgette Turet, her economist husband Jean Connet, and important man that he is, Jean has gone away for a business trip in Switzerland. And while he's gone, Georgette gets a call from her old friend and veteran skirt chaser, Julien Cablon, who invites her out dancing. Now, respectable married woman that she is, Georgette initially says no. But she's bored, and Julien is a convincing guy, so she eventually agrees. And she says, but don't get any ideas, understood? And Julien replies, you can count on me. I know how to respect women, especially when they are married. And so Julien picks her up in a sporty Ford Capri and whisks her away to the Mississippi nightclub where they drink whiskeys and dance the jerk. And of course, Julien, ever the rogue, soon confesses his attraction to Georgette, who very angrily rebuffs his advance. The night ends with Georgette storming out of the nightclub club in a huff, but she leaves an earring behind on the dance floor by mistake. Of course, when Georgette comes home, she discovers that her husband Jean has returned from his conference earlier than planned. And knowing him to be a jealous man, she lies about her evening at the nightclub. And so here are Georgette and Jean in their home. I think I read this as a kind of window into the aspirational life of a professional couple. We see their living rooms, well-appointed interior, complete with television, a plush sofa, a shelf stacked with books and decorative objets. Now, back to the story. As you might imagine, the truth about Georgette's evening outing eventually comes out. When a boy from the Mississippi nightclub arrives at their door to return her lost earring, Georgette is forced to admit that she went out dancing with Julien. And furious, Jean insists immediately on a divorce and sends her home to her parents in Quetiola, which is a rural town in central Côte d'Ivoire. Then we fast forward 3 months later, and things are even worse. Georgette returns to Jean, and her prominent belly reveals a bombshell. She's pregnant. Convinced that the baby isn't his, Jean feels all the more justified in divorcing her and sends Georgette back to her parents once again. The Photoromances denouement brings the reader to the unpaved roads of rural Quetiola a few years later. Jean is now the Ivoirian ambassador to France, and he's in town on holiday with his friend Victor. And in Quetiola, Victor encounters a child whose resemblance to Jean is simply uncanny. He talks to the child who says, Maman says my name is Jean and that my father is called Connet. He is an ambassador. Victor replies, this cunning little devil is messing with you. How does he know you're an ambassador? Victor and Jean ask the child to lead them to his mother. And of course, a few minutes later, they find themselves in the presence of Georgette. She's now a poorly coiffed peasant, but still beautiful. We find that Jean and Georgette meet in a warm embrace. Jean says, forgive me, darling. I was wrong to suspect you. Our child has saved our love. She replies, let's forget the past. The essential is that you have come back to me. The final cell is also the Photoromances cover, a closely cropped shot of Jean and Georgette, their faces turned toward their young son. A moral comedy, not unlike Molière, Our Child Saved Our Love very clearly champions this model of the modern patriarchal nuclear family. Jean, this executive husband, is a successful provider. Georgette is a beautiful and loyal wife. The child is a boy. This is the vision of the Civil Code. But the story also acknowledges the challenges of maintaining this ideal in a lively city filled with temptations. One night out at the Mississippi could spell ruin for a young couple. And here I want to very quickly note that the Mississippi was an actual nightclub in Abidjan. And more generally, it was not uncommon for photoromances to occupy these liminal spaces between the real and the fictive. They were set in spaces that readers might recognize, allowing them to interpolate themselves into these narratives. And so, in this way, you might imagine how female readers might have identified with the vulnerability of the urban housewife. Georgette's comfortable life, complete with television and telephone, is precarious. And ultimately, she is subject to the whims of her breadwinner husband. And in the scene in Quechua, readers are also reminded that the modernizing nation's rural past is not quite so past at all. The village can reclaim anyone who doesn't find fortune in the big city. And so this, for the Photoromances, really depicts the promise and perils of conjugal life in the modernizing capital city. Georgette and Jean's marriage, however aspirational, also acknowledges the uncertainties of Abidjan in the era of the Ivoirian miracle. Now I'd like to turn to our second Photoromance. This one is titled Marthe l'Ingrate, or Marthe the Ungrateful. It centers on Jean-Baptiste Augier, who is a respectable accountant, his wife, Odette, who's a seamstress, and his mistress, Marthe Adjo. The narrative opens at their family dinner table, where Odette asks her husband for money for Christmas shopping. Jean-Baptiste refuses. He says that there's simply no money for presents this year, and Odette is furious. Jean-Baptiste never gives her enough money, and without her work as a seamstress, she says that the kids would have nothing to eat. She exclaims, "What is the point of being a chief accountant in a large parastatal and having a Mercedes if you can't properly feed and clothe your wife and children?" Now, Jean-Baptiste is a big man who will not tolerate this kind of criticism. And so he storms out of the house in a fit of pique and into the arms of his beautiful young mistress, Marthe Adjo. Now, unlike Odette, Marthe wants for nothing. She lives in a luxuriously furnished apartment, complete with refrigerator, television, and telephone. She's also dressed in the latest fashions. Unlike Odette, who wears a traditional bang and matching head wrap, Marthe wears a printed maxi dress and chic pixie cut wig. Jean-Baptiste showers Marthe with compliments and, more importantly, with money. We learn that he's written her checks for groceries, clothing, and even a car worth 1,000,000 francs. But soon it becomes clear that most of Jean-Baptiste's salary is actually going to his mistress and not his wife and 5 children. And on top of this, we learn that Jean-Baptiste is also embezzling money from his firm. He is a real piece of work. Meanwhile, desperate for support, Odette complains to her in-laws, who are frankly appalled by their son's deceit. His mother is particularly scandalized. She says, "A mistress? Is he crazy? If he wants a second wife, he should marry her so that she can help you around the house." Soon the 3 confront Jean-Baptiste, but he is unmoved. He says, "A mistress? That's different. Everyone in Abidjan has one these days." And what's more, he simply threatens to leave Odette for his mistress altogether. But back at the office, the chickens have come home to roost. Jean-Baptiste's boss has now accused him of embezzlement because 1.2 million francs are missing from the office budget. And if they're not back within a week, they're calling the police. To recover the funds, he suggests that Jean-Baptiste sign over his Mercedes for 1,000,000 francs cash. And now the question remains, how will he make up the remaining 200,000 francs? Naturally, Jean-Baptiste returns to his mistress. But Marthe simply refuses. And to add insult to injury, she simply waves her wrists before him as she declares, "Do you see this? Who do you think you are? Small-time accountant, thief, these gold and diamond jewels, these dresses, do you think perhaps it was you who bought them? I'm telling you tonight, you were never my only lover. You're a loser, and I never asked you to steal to support me. Goodbye." And so Jean-Baptiste returns home, where he confesses everything to Odette. and reveals that Marthe, the ungrateful, has refused to help him. Odette, ever loyal, volunteers to dip into her savings to come up with the money to save him and his honor. And Jean-Baptiste is overwhelmed with gratitude. He says, I promise you that from now on, I will be for you the pearl of husbands and for my children the best of fathers. The end. So Marthe the Ungrateful narrates a very common trope in 1970s Abidjan. Basic impulses toward greed, corruption, and deceit often got in the way of the Civil Code's vision of a wholesome nuclear family. In his desire to project his status and modernity, the salaried cadre neglects his loyal wife in favor of his sexy but ultimately faithless mistress. The purchase of consumer luxuries, the sharp suit, the expensive wig, the luxury car is a sign of prosperity, but also a potential path to ruin. And in the end, the cadre learns that maintaining a mistress, while exciting, simply does not pay. But I do find it difficult to ignore the insincerity of the Photoromances conclusion. Could Odette really be that loyal? Was Jean-Baptiste truly ready to commit to his wife for good? Who hasn't promised to never do that again at the end of a fight? Only Marthe's reaction seems convincing to me. She leaves Jean-Baptiste as soon as she realizes that he has nothing left to offer her. In the life of mistress, money always comes before love. I think the hollowness of this moral might explain the intensity of the letters that were written into Idée in the weeks that followed the publication of this photoromance. A number of readers wrote in, positioning themselves as either for or against the genre, the photoromance as a genre in itself. Some criticized them as silly trifles that had no business in a serious magazine. But other readers wrote approvingly of the photoromance as a source of potential life lessons. Quote, the facts recounted here are the very ones to which we must open our eyes in so-called modern everyday life. But one anonymous group of female readers found especially little to cheer in the photoromance, which they viewed as all too representative of their daily lives. Please stop these ridiculous photographers who reveal in broad daylight what is happening in almost all of our households, and we are so ashamed. Husbands who deprive themselves of nothing, they are everywhere. They have cars, natty suits, ruinous mistresses. They go out whenever they want without giving explanations. And we women must stay and calmly wait for them, run the house, raise the children, work, only to receive bad words and often blows in return. So with this in mind, I want to suggest that in publishing these photoromances, Idée really was not interested in simply repackaging state propaganda. I think it was also interested in creating a discursive environment in which audiences could try to make sense of their lived experiences in this equally exciting and destabilizing independence moment. And by writing into the magazine, readers actively interpolated their lives onto the pages of these photoromances. As they read about Georgette's unlucky night out at the Mississippi, or Jean-Baptiste's personal and financial indiscretions, and Odette's struggles simply to feed her children, readers imagine their troubles alongside those of these fictional characters. Now, by way of conclusion, I want to offer two notes. One, the first is to return to this idea of the overlap of the real and the fictive. I mentioned earlier that photoromances were set in locations that could be recognizable to their readers. The Mississippi was a very real, popular nightclub. Other photoromances feature street scenes that had familiar landmarks and so on. But I also want to note that Idée's editorial staff, like their readers, also view the concerns expressed in photoromances as deeply relevant to contemporary life. And so in 1977, Idée published an article titled Husbands and Wives, the Impossible Dialogue as their cover story. You can see these, this husband and wife are literally at each other's throats. And the feature reports on conflicts in conjugal relationships as they were shaped by these tensions between tradition and modernity. But to illustrate the report, they actually bring back photographs they had published 6 years ago in the 1971 Photoromance, Martha the Ungrateful. And so you can see the ways that Ide interpolated its readers as at once through its own reporting, but also through its creative production in these photoromances. Now, my final note here is on the legacies of the photoromance. With the rise of film and television in Côte d'Ivoire, photoromances start to fall out of favor in the 1980s. And I think this is somewhat unsurprising. Even Paul Kodjo, toward the end of his life, expressed regrets that he never got to make his photoromances into movies, which is how he really saw these narratives. But I want to note that gender and conjugality remain quite central themes in Ivoirian cultural production. One example of this is the telenovela style TV series Ma Famille, which was wildly popular not only in Cote d'Ivoire, but also throughout the West African region in the 2000s. And in fact, the show's creator, Akisi Delta, actually got her start as an actress or model in Paul Kodjo's early photoromances in the 1970s. Another example of this is Aya de Yopougon or Aya Life in Yop City, which is a very popular graphic novel that some of you may be familiar with. It follows the friendships and romances of young women and their families in late 1970s Abidjan. All this is to say that stories about love, marriage, and infidelity, about family obligations and conjugal disruptions remain enduring sites of Ivorian self-fashioning. And I think these media forms have important antecedents in the 1970s photoromances I've talked to you about today. So thank you. With that, I'll finish up and I welcome your questions.